Oh, okay. Thank you everyone so much for being here for our last webinar of the year in our lunchtime webinar series. We are very excited to bring this back next year. But to get started today, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jane from GPS to go ahead and introduce this.
Working on my video and all that fun logistics that we try to bring into scope. I hope everyone is doing well. I know it's beautiful outside, and I thank you for joining us today. Welcome to today's session. My name is Dr. Jane Linneman. Please feel free to call me Jane. I currently serve as a student safety coordinator within Student Equity and Opportunity, and I am going to support with moderating today's session. As a reminder, today's session will be recorded with captions, and the recording and the resources will be shared out with you via email following the conclusion of today's presentation. We will provide access to chat, and there will be time at the end of the session for us to engage in some questions and answers. At this time, we ask that all participants mute their microphone to minimize any type of disruptions to this particular session. Today's session is provided in collaboration with Judi's House. The Department of Social Work and Psychological Services has long partnered with Judi's House, really to work to ensure that our youth have access to grief and loss services. And you may be aware, all of our DPS schools have access to mental health providers that do include school psychologists, social workers, counselors, and nurses. Our teams work to support students impacted by mental health needs. And when they're impacted by grief and loss, we really work to support our families by accessing some of those community mental health services, such as Judi's House. We're excited to share information today on the impact of the pandemic and how adults can create an understanding and connection with youth who are grieving. We know that COVID has brought on a pandemic of grief that will likely impact our schools and community for years to come. And this particular webinar is specifically tailored for adults who want to learn how to create an understanding and in connection with grieving youth. Judi's House counselors will share information about grief and bereavement, and they will review children's common grief reactions and coping. Following, they are going to provide you with some tools for supporting children and teens. At this point, it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce Ms. Katie Wilberging-Cross, who is a licensed clinical social worker, is the assistant director of Judi's House's community-based care and the Judi's House JAG. Katie, what is JAG? She's going to unmute.
There we go. The Judith Ann Greasy Foundation.
Thank you. Institute. Perfect. She's been with the organization for over 9 years and has served in many roles, including providing some direct services in the Pathfinders program and supervising graduate and postgraduate trainees. In her current role, dedicated specifically to community-based programs, Katie works with school districts, schools, and other organizations to really work to bring Judi's programming to youth who do not have access to bereavement services. And she also provides some really great specialized trainings in grief education to youth and professionals and parents. And I know she is excited to be here. So I am going to pass it over to her and welcome her to this particular session. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Jane. Welcome, everyone. And I thank you for joining, for taking time out of your busy days to learn about this important topic. I'm honored to share this information with you all today. And so while you heard about who I am and a little bit about my background, I would love to learn a little bit more about who is joining us today. So I know we have 2 really quick poll questions that Leah, I think, is going to post. Is that right, Leah? Or Haley? There we go. All right, so everyone that's here, you see it should pop up on your screen. So just select which, for that first question, who is joining us today? So select all that apply. So are you a teacher, an administrator, a student support person, a parent or guardian, a student community member, or maybe you don't fit into any of those categories. And so just curious who's here, because it can really help kind of have a better idea of my information that I'm going to be sharing. And so that second question that you are answering, so what is your connection? So are you supporting someone who's grieving? Are you actively grieving? What are you hoping to find some information around, for your life? All right, so I see for that first question, great. So for the first one, it looks like, I don't know. Let's see. Do I end the poll, Leah, or do you end the poll? All right. Okay, great. So I see most people are here to learn about supporting students, but it looks like we have a little bit of representation around all the other groups. There's somebody from each of those, whether you're a teacher, admin, parent, guardian. Actually, there's no students here, which is probably good because this is information tailored for adults. So that's a good thing. And then it looks like most people are supporting someone who's grieving, whether it be in those different roles and capacities and all the different identities that we have, right? All right. Thank you for doing that. That's really helpful. I think that's all I can see. I don't know if there's any other. Great. Wonderful. All right, I'm gonna close that. All right. So really hoping that you'll walk away with some new knowledge about how to support grieving kids, some things you can expect from grieving kids, how to support with coping, and then when to seek some outside support, because we know that this topic can be heavy. So just want to take a moment and acknowledge that grief can be hard. This can be a sensitive topic. And so just want to encourage everyone who's listening in today to please take breaks if you need it. That I know this can bring up different parts of our own life experiences, current or past, and folks in our lives that we're connected to. So if you notice yourself feeling upset or overwhelmed, please walk away, take a break, encourage you to do what you need to do to help yourself feel calm and present to this webinar. The second piece, I just want to acknowledge the importance of, and this is more a commitment that I make to you in this webinar, is the importance of respect. And so really at Judi's house, we value that everyone deserves that level of respect, no matter what your race, ethnicity, gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic, how much money you make, age, religion, all these parts of who we are and that make us unique will be respected today. And then finally, please, just wanted to share some additional resources. If, again, while I'm talking today or even after this webinar, if you notice that you need to reach out to someone, here's just a couple real quick resources. Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners, otherwise known as Colorado Crisis Services, has the same phone number there. They're really great, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, resources to help with crisis, but also if you just need to reach out for some sort of support, that is available as well. And then Safe to Tell is great if you're worried about another student, or that's a really great resource as well. Jane, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you're providing some really great resources. I would just say that if you're worried about anyone, please reach out and get some support. I know you are about to transition into some additional content. If I could just ask for the tech folks who are supporting us to make sure that those captions get turned on. I'm going to give it back to you, Katie. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That's important. And I noticed that those resources were added in the chat. So even after I pass this slide, feel free to write those down, take note of those, look them up online. They're really, really great resources in the community. And of course, as always, reach out to your school support systems. Those school counselors, social workers, psychologists are really great resources as well. All right, so just want to give a little bit of history about Judi's House. So Judi's House is a nonprofit organization located in Denver, Colorado. Founded in 2002 by Brian Greasy and Dr. Brooke Greasy in honor of Brian's mom, Judi, who died when he was 12. She died from breast cancer. And Brian talks about how that experience was really hard for him. And so as an adult, really felt passionately about having a place for kids and families who have experienced a death loss to find connection and healing. And so we provide comprehensive grief support to kids and families, kids ages 3 to 25 and their adult caregivers, different types of therapeutic grief support, different types of trainings like this one, and really focused on moving this, this conversation along in order to create sensitive spaces and supportive spaces for grieving kids. And so all of Judi's House services are provided at no cost to our families. And so if you are thinking you could use free grief support for you and your family, look Judi's House up on the website. I'll have some information in the follow-up materials that you'll be able to look at. If you want to reach out to access our services, all you have to do is give us a call. We don't have any sort of referral process or note or anything like that from a doctor or a school representative. All you have to do is give us a call. So want to start off. So that's who we are, that's who you are, who I am, what Judi's House is. So want to dive into what is grief. So I know that there's a lot of different ideas about what grief is and a lot of assumptions. So just want to start off with a really broad definition. And so at Judi's House, we say that grief is all of the thoughts, feelings, and reactions we have after we lose someone or something. And I know, as has been mentioned, the pandemic, COVID-19, has caused a lot of grief and loss in how we moved through the world, how we saw ourselves as safe and secure, and how we could interact with people and how our kids could go to school. And a lot of that has changed through the course of the pandemic. And so just acknowledging that loss of our assumptive world or how we thought things were has been grief for a lot of folks. And there's a lot of different thoughts and feelings around that experience. Just a few other examples that we know come up around grief are, when someone is deported or incarcerated, maybe there's divorce or separation in families, when foster care, kinship care, those sorts of changes and losses, any kinds of moves or changes in friends, changes in communities, any kind of big life change and transition can bring up grief for folks. And so just acknowledging that this is a really broad topic. And so at Judi's House, we really focus on bereavement, which the definition for bereavement is that sort of grief experience related to the death of an important person. So really focusing at Judi's House and in our work of wanting to have conversations about death and about grief, and that we acknowledge we live in a society that tends to avoid these topics because they're hard. As I mentioned, grief can be difficult. It can bring up a lot of different thoughts and feelings. And we know for kids and for youth who have experienced the death of someone, we want them to know that this is something they can talk about, that they can reach out for support, right? That they can talk to the trusted adults in their lives, because we want to be able to wrap around them in a meaningful way. And so really wanting to have these conversations that grief and bereavement and loss are things that we can talk about because they happen. We know at Judi's House that we say that grief related to a death loss is a universal life experience. This is something that will touch every single person at some point in our lives. That we know sometimes that happens for kids and youth, like Brian Greasy, who started Judi's House, and many of the youth in the schools and communities that we all are involved in, right? That this is something that touches kids and adults. And so it's something that is universal. We also believe and acknowledge that grief is unique. And so it is not a one size fits all. This is an experience that is different for each person because we are different. Our relationships with people are different. Our experiences of the losses are different. And so being able to hold that there is no right or wrong, or you're supposed to cry, you're supposed to feel sad, that we don't hold any of those expectations of what grief looks like at Judi's House. We also believe that there is no timeline to grief or bereavement, that there is not a set number of days, minutes, years that it takes to grieve, and that it's a lifelong process. It's something we continue to figure out. How is this impacting me now? How do I feel, or how do I manage my grief at this point in my life? Because it will continue to come up for years and our whole lives potentially. we also believe that each individual has the capacity to heal, that sometimes it does mean that we need to reach out for support, whether it be through the school or mental health resources, community mental health, organizations like Judi's House, to be able to manage those grief-related reactions that we're having. And then a final definition is mourning. So what is mourning? So it's a word that gets connected with grief and bereavement. And we say that mourning is how we display that grief to others and to the world. And so we know that mourning is that external representation, or what we see. And so this is really connected with things like certain clothing that we might wear, or jewelry that we might wear. Sometimes when people are mourning, it's a very external representation of that grief. So crying, wailing, fainting, but sometimes folks are more private, and there's no right or wrong, that it's just, how do we display that to others, acknowledging religious beliefs or practices or family values and things like that. So this is very unique as well. And again, there's no right or wrong to that either. Just want to show a quick visual representation of acknowledging that grief is complex. And so we know that even for families and folks who have experienced the death loss, we want grief to be this beginning, middle, end, right? That the death happens, I experience some thoughts and feelings and reactions, and then there's an end. And at Judi's House, we believe that, and we acknowledge that that's not true, that grief is messy and it's complex and it's up and down, it's forwards, it's backwards, and it depends a lot on the relationship to the person that died, how they died, the child or the individual who is grieving, and that there is not a certain number of stages or experiences that one goes through when they're grieving, that and again, it's a lifelong process, hence those arrows at the end rather than an end point. So next, I want to share some information about how to support grieving families. And so whether you yourself are a part of a grieving family, or you're wanting to reach out to someone who is grieving, or you're a professional at a school who wants to figure out, how do I support the kids that I'm working with? And so hopefully be able to have some ideas for things to say or things to do when offering support to families who are experiencing grief and bereavement specifically. And so I'm going to put up some statements. I'm going to go through these somewhat quickly, and you will get the slides after this presentation as well, that those will be in that follow-up email. So just want to let you know that before I go through them too quickly. And so I'm going to run through some examples. And so just thinking within yourself, is this helpful or hurtful to say to a grieving family member or a grieving family in my life? I heard about your loss. I'm here if you want to talk or just need some company. Helpful, right? That it's okay to acknowledge grief. It's okay to acknowledge death and loss, and to let someone know, hey, I'm here if you want to talk or if you just need some company, but not pressuring either, right? Not saying you need to tell me what happened, but I'm here. I'm here for you. I care about you. I want you to know this is something that I can handle talking about, because we know, as I said, that oftentimes people avoid it or don't bring it up, that, hey, I heard about this and I'm here for you. The next one is, I know how you must feel. So we would say this one is hurtful. And so I know that all of these are nuanced and are going to depend on ourselves and our relationships. And so just want to acknowledge that I'm making them black and white, hurtful, helpful, and that they are so much more complex than that. As I just mentioned, that grief is complex, right? And so in general, we caution folks from saying, I know how you must feel, because we never know someone else's full experience. We don't know what they're feeling. Even if they say, I'm feeling sad, that can mean so many different things for different folks and different kids, right? And so cautioning that, I know how you must feel. I've been through something similar. I've had my own death loss experiences, that really having that sense of curiosity around what someone else's experience is. They said he died suddenly, but didn't say how. I wonder if he committed suicide. So we would say this one is hurtful. And so a few layers around this one: grief and loss and suicide are not things to gossip about, to kind of spread rumors, to those sorts of pieces. So taking that out. So that's the first piece. The second piece is, at Judi's House, we actually, and speculation, taking out speculation and things like that around that gossip, around talking about these sorts of situations. And then the second piece around this one is it says committed suicide. And actually at Judi's house and in a lot of bereavement organizations and fields, that we really encourage folks to shift that language and say died by suicide instead. Just because when people think about the word committed, they think about someone committed a crime, they did something bad. And so really wanting to have a lot of compassion for people who die by suicide, because we know they were probably going through a lot, whether it be addiction, mental illness, trauma. And so having a lot of compassion for folks who died by suicide, and really want to encourage, again, utilizing the resources in our community if someone you know or yourself are experiencing these sorts of thoughts. Next. Would you like me to go pick up your groceries, watch the kids for an hour, or mow your lawn? So we would say this one is helpful. I know oftentimes we hear, let me know what you need. And so that statement, although coming from a very compassionate, well-intentioned place, can really put that responsibility on the grieving family to figure out, I don't know what I need. I'm just trying to get through the day to day. Everything feels really hard right now. I'm probably not going to reach out for help, right? And so when you come and you say, I can get your groceries, I can watch your kids, I can mow your lawn, it gives them options for where they can utilize that support. And so providing those concrete examples of things that you can offer. And, I think a lot of folks think about the offering a meal, right? That's one that can be really supportive too, but just some other ideas to offer. And again, letting them decide if that's something they want to take advantage of, rather than pressuring, like, I'm going to do this, letting them know, hey, I'm here for these things. I'd really like to offer support because I care about you. Next one. I know how hard things are for you right now, but you need to be strong. Your kids need you. Hurtful, right? I think as a society, we associate strong with not showing emotion, right? Stuffing it down, don't cry, be tough. I need to be there for my kids, right? That's not supportive in grief, especially when maybe the adults are grieving, and that, to be able to create space to say, hey, being strong sometimes means being vulnerable, showing your kids that it's okay to cry. You're modeling that for them too. And so it's okay to cry in front of kids when we're grieving, and to let them know that I get my support from my family, my friends, my support people, so that I can be there for you. And so really letting folks know that there are spaces to express whatever is going on for them, and that kids need to see that too. Next one. I know it's been a year since your child passed away. I just wanted to check in. Helpful. So just with this one is really to encourage paying attention to those important dates. We know we talk about grief waves at Judi's house, and this ebb and flow over our lifetimes of how grief can come up in more intense ways, and maybe where it feels more manageable. And so just acknowledging that some of those important dates, birthdays, the anniversary of the death, other important dates that might be important to that family are ones that you might want to, to be supportive to them, write those down, put them in your phone, check in, just letting them know, hey, I know it's been about a year. I just wanted to check in, not making assumptions, because maybe they're like, yeah, it's been a year and we're doing okay. Creating space, and maybe they're really struggling. So just opening that up. I just wanted to check in, not making assumptions about what it means, just letting them know you're there. All right. Hopefully you gain some helpful words. I know a lot of times when I work with kids and families and schools, there's a desire to say, what should I say? And so hopefully that little activity or exercise has provided some ideas, maybe some new ways of thinking about being supportive to folks who are grieving. Next, I want to talk real briefly about grief across the lifespan. And so I think there's maybe one more poll question, and if there's not, that's okay. I know the polls are new to us as well. And so if there is one more, you can post it now while I'm talking. And so we know that grief can change throughout our lives. And so acknowledging that how it impacts youth is different depending on how old they are. And so, oh, there's the poll, yay. So great. So we know that several of you may have experienced a death loss in your life. So if you could select which age group you were when you had someone in your life die, and you can select multiple, or of course, we have a really great rule at Judi's house. It's called I pass. You don't have to answer if you don't feel comfortable. That is completely acceptable as well. I'm seeing answers come in. There is, so across these different age groups, there's representation in all of them. And it looks like maybe it's slowed down a little bit.
And Katie?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. As everyone is finishing answering, would you be able to go, are you using PowerPoint or Google Slides?
PowerPoint.
There should be an option to turn on captioning.
Yes.
If possible.
And that is, let's see. Poll is in my way.
And let me see. And I'm so sorry, I am used to Google Slides, so I'm not able to give good direction on how to turn on closed captioning on PowerPoint.
I'm not, let's see, what's this? I don't know how to do that either.
Okay, well, I'm so sorry for everybody for not being able to get captioning on and all of the other technical issues. I do apologize.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you want me to keep looking or?
I think it's okay if we continue on. Just our apologies to the audience. We will make sure that we are a little bit better during our next session. Thank you for your patience.
Okay. So thank you everyone who participated in the poll. It looks like sorry, I was trying to figure, okay. So it looks like there was a large, each age group had representation from the audience, and a lot of folks had adults, but also all across age groups. And it kind of was, as adults was the largest, and then it went down. And so just acknowledging that grief and death exists at various points in our lives. And so just wanting to acknowledge that when we experience death loss can impact how we understand it and how we process that death and how we experience that throughout our lives. And so wanting to just let you know, and this is a handout on our website that goes into a bit more detail around how kids in different age groups understand grief. And so we know when kids are younger, they're very concrete. And so death can be a really difficult concept to understand. And so sometimes, you know, we really have to repeat things to kids. We encourage folks to be honest about what happened, including using words like dead, died, and death, and not saying passed away or went to sleep, because those terms can be confusing for kids. And so really using those concrete words to describe what happened. We know in middle school and high school, kids are really concerned about some of those peer relationships. And so acknowledging that they may not talk about their grief. They may not be as open to sharing their experience with others because they don't want to be seen as different or to stand out. And so that can be a complex piece in grief. We know that for teens and young adults that there's a lot of identity. So who am I? What does this mean in terms of who I am and how I move through the world with regards to this loss? And so just really having a lot of awareness that as kids get older and as they understand death in different ways, we may see different types of reactions in that grief. And we know changes in behaviors, changes in eating, sleeping, relationships are all normal parts of grief reactions, and really wanting to pay attention to when maybe we feel more concerned that things have changed so much that, you know, I just am concerned about my child. Again, those are times to reach out to somebody, reach out to someone at the school, reach out to a mental health center or someone that you trust to maybe get that additional support in place. So I want to share a bit more in detail about different types of grief reactions. And so we know that there's a lot of different types of reactions for kids. And I know I mentioned that there's no right or wrong, right? And so I know I get the question sometimes around, my kid isn't crying after their person died, what's wrong with them? And we'll always say there's nothing wrong with them. That's part of their grief experience, right? As long as we're opening up conversations and providing support and opportunities to talk about it, there's no one way to grieve. And so we talk about 4 different types of grief reactions. And again, this is another handout on our website that will be linked in the follow-up materials. And so really want to acknowledge emotional reactions. So those feelings that sometimes come up, we know themes of sadness, anger, worries, guilt, but also relief and love are all parts of those emotional reactions to grief. Next are the cognitive reactions, or these are the thoughts. So these are the words or pictures that go through our minds related to our grief. So maybe these are things like, I miss them so much. This is so unfair. Why did this happen? Maybe even recalling memories of the person. And so we know a lot of times these thoughts can make it really hard to focus on things that we need to think about, whether it's adults or kids. And we know sometimes grief can make it hard for kids to focus in school, that we know adults sometimes will say, I feel like I'm crazy. I can't think clearly. I can't remember things. Those are all normal parts of a grief reaction in terms of those thoughts, those cognitive reactions. Next are behaviors. And so behaviors we know can be sometimes more meltdowns, temper tantrums, withdrawing from others. Maybe it's different sorts of pieces of being more irritable or frustrated. Again, ourselves and kids, right? And so big changes in terms of, especially with teens, just want to acknowledge that sometimes those behaviors are related to risk-taking behaviors. And so we just really want to make sure we're paying attention for teens around safety. So, drugs, alcohol, cars, things like that, that we're really paying attention to some of those changes that may come up in their grief as well in terms of behaviors. And then finally are the physical reactions. So we talk about body reactions. And so sometimes for kids, these are tummy aches, headaches, sometimes it's stress, grinding teeth, right? And so these are different ways that our bodies respond as it relates to the grief. And we know that sometimes kids who are grieving are more susceptible to getting sick. So wanting to make sure that we're paying attention to, is this a grief reaction or, what else is going on? And so we talk about these 4 different grief reactions as being separate and connected, because we know that these are all happening at the same time, and really want to focus in on this stoplight within each of us and within each child, which can help us manage these different reactions. Because when they're feeling frustrated and overwhelmed and they feel like they want to punch their sibling, right? It's important to teach them to pay attention to that stoplight, to take that deep breath, to slow down and utilize a coping strategy. And so being able to pay attention to, what are the things that I can do that can maybe help me feel better? So whether it be a big, giant, deep breath, just to help bring oxygen to my brain, to help me feel more calm in my body, right? It might be getting it out. So exercise, punching a pillow, maybe it's getting it out through artwork, right? Or journaling, those sorts of things. Maybe seeking comfort. So how do we find things that feel soothing to us? Maybe it's hugging a pillow or getting a hug from someone we trust. Maybe it's spending some time with our favorite blanket or a stuffed animal for a child or an adult. Cognitive coping, so noticing our thoughts, paying attention to when they're not super helpful or when they're harmful, and being able to notice those to be able to stop them and switch to something more neutral or helpful. And of course, always paying attention to our own self-care needs, whether it be engaging in things that help us feel fulfilled and help us find joy in the day-to-day. Can also be things like going to the doctor and making sure that we are taking care of our bodies in that way, and the bodies of the kids that we are connected to. So knowing that there are so many different coping strategies, and knowing that grief reactions will come up, and continuing to pay attention to, how do I manage these in healthy ways, and how do I support the people in my life to manage these in healthy ways as well. All right, next is a real brief survey. So I'm about to wrap up and we can open it up to the Q&A in just a moment. I have a couple more slides, but before we get to those, would love for the survey to get posted in the chat. And so you should be able to, let's see, Leah can post that in the chat, I believe. And then everyone, if you could just go in real quick, maybe. Leah, can you post the survey in the chat for me? There it is. So if everyone could, it's just a real quick survey. It should take just a minute or two to fill out. We are able to provide services and trainings and workshops at Judi's house for free. And so your survey responses are really invaluable to us to continue being able to do the really important work that we do for free. So if you could go in and fill that out real quick. If you are not able to get into that right now, we'll make sure to include that link in the follow-up information as well, just to be able to get your thoughts, responses, feedback, insights, all of those things. Because again, those are really incredibly, incredibly valuable to the work that we do. So thank you for filling those out for me. And so we'll give just maybe another 20 seconds for folks to wrap that up. And then I will put all of this information together, and then we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Katie, for sharing that valuable content and information with our participants today. I know that this can be a heavy discussion at times, and sometimes we're not quite sure how to navigate resources. So we really appreciate you coming and sharing that information. I'm going to give folks just a little bit more time to fill out that survey for Katie. I know that she uses that feedback to really help inform how we can provide good information to participants and make sure that our kids have access to services.
Yep.
And then I'm just going to open it up for questions. If anyone has a question, if you just can raise your hand or you can put it over in the chat, I'm happy to help moderate any of those questions.
Wonderful. And so just some real quick kind of putting all the information together real quick, just this kind of wrap up thoughts around acknowledging that grief is different for each person. The need for support lasts much longer than people think. It's not a 1 year and done, a few months and done. It's a lifelong journey. And so this need for support lasts much longer than people assume. It's okay to reach out, bring it up, talk about grief, talk about death. It's okay to bring it up and give people space when they need it, and remember those resources that we've talked about. And then have just a quick quote for you that we use at Judi's house, which is that grief is not about letting go. It's about holding on in a different way.
So we do have a question, Katie. One of our participants is asking if you have any favorite children's books or for children to explain grief and loss.
Yes, we have so many books. And it's interesting. I just was looking at our book list recently, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quick so that I can. There we go. When Dinosaurs Die is one that we use at Judi's house. I know there's a lot of really other great ones, kind of depending on situation. There's a lot of really great specific ones around different types of grief. We know like there's some that are, for example, The Invisible String, in terms of that connection with the person that died even after their body is no longer alive, but that we continue connecting with them through that relationship. I believe a few other, I can pull up my list. If you send your email, I'm happy to email you our lengthy list.
Katie, I know you plan to send an email to our participants today with some resources. Would you be willing just to attach a list to that email for them? Perfect.
Sure, absolutely. And I know sometimes it's more I have to scale them back a little bit because there are so many really great resources. There's a few great websites, even in terms of the National Alliance for Grieving Children has a really great parent-child workbook on their website. And so that's a really great resource as well to heal in that grief and to process those different types of reactions and that healing process within that family as well.
Nice. Similarly, we do have some practitioners on the call, specifically psych, social workers, and counselors. And someone is reaching out saying, do you recommend any books or curricular that they could particularly access and maybe to grow their own services related to grief and loss when working with children?
Yeah, it's so funny. I have it like handy in it's a little dusty right now, because we sometimes at Judi's house, so we have a curriculum that we use in terms of our grief groups and supporting families. And the book so our curriculum, because as I mentioned, Judi's house being a nonprofit and wanting to protect our intellectual property, we don't share our curriculum. But when I get that question, this is the book that I share with folks, because it is And I can share that in the follow-up. It's Grief and Trauma in Children, an evidence-based treatment manual by Allison Saloom. And so that's when it has some great interventions for folks who are wanting to have their own grief groups at schools and things like that, because I know that is a request and a question I get often. So that's kind of my go-to recommendation for that one.
We have another question. I'm trying to find it. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's also some really great resources online that have some good content on them as well. And so the Coalition to Support Grieving Students, so it's grievingstudents.org. That's a really great resource. And then they have a lot of really good content, and they have little modules, videos, things like that. And they have a lot of different, so it's grievingstudents.org if you want to pop that into some great content on there in terms of supporting grieving kids in schools. And then the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement is my other go-to that I recommend. Schoolcrisiscenter.org is the website for that one. So that's another good one too.
Nice. We have a participant that's asking, can you talk a little bit more about what Judi's House's groups are like for kids?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And so at Judi's House, we really work with the whole family. And so it sounds like the question specifically about our groups. And so I'll talk about that specifically, but know that there are other kind of processes in order to get to the group piece. And then we know group isn't necessarily the right fit for every single person. And so we do have individual and couples and family therapy, virtual and in person right now. So really wanting to have a lot of options for grieving families to get the support that they need. And so specifically our group, so as I mentioned, we do offer a curriculum-based group. And so it's a 10 session, typically meets once a week at Judi's House. And in my role in working with schools, we're able to bring those curriculum-based groups into middle schools throughout the Denver metro area. And so this curriculum, as I mentioned, is 10 sessions. And so the groups are what we call peer-based. And so we group folks together by age. So we have parent guardian groups, but also groups for teenagers, middle schoolers, elementary, littles, we call them. So our sometimes preschoolers, depending on where we're at in the pandemic and all those things too. And so really able to tailor the conversations and the activities and how we're talking about grief and where they're at in a way that's going to make sense for that age group. So we know, 5-year-olds are not going to be able to have a conversation like teenagers and adults. And so we have a lot of art and play and different ways that we support kids in expressing their grief, because we know it's so important to be able to meet kids and where they're at in this experience, because it can be hard to understand. It can be confusing. It can bring up a lot of different thoughts and feelings, as I mentioned. And so really wanting to create that space for kids to express where they're at and have questions. And then also, so all those groups that I mentioned in those different age groups are having conversations around similar topics. So we'll talk about grief, we'll talk about coping, we'll talk about memories. And so then after group, that family then goes home together and continues those conversations. Hey, we learned about deep belly breathing in group today. Oh, we did too. How did that go? So really hoping that the family can continue those conversations and connecting in your grief.
And it's so important for families and youth to feel supported by each other. And it's lovely that they are able to learn some of those skills alongside each other as they both process. We know school is almost out. I know summer is coming, and summer tends to be a really great time for families to reconnect and access some different opportunities. And we have a participant who's kind of inquiring if you have any recommendations on summer camps where kids can come together with other kids who've experienced loss.
We do. There's a lot of really I just got an email today about a camp that I hadn't heard about, and it was for specific. I mean, there are camps. I have a colleague who manages our camp list that I do not have in I'm sure I can find it if you give me just a minute. But I know even the one I heard about today was specifically for teens grieving a suicide loss. And so there's, even camps that can really provide, and again, that connection is such an important part of that healing in the grief. And so really being able to provide those opportunities, whether it be at Judi's house, that we're able to provide opportunities to relate on what a suicide grief experience is like. Let's see, the name of the camp that I just mentioned was Camp JoJo, but I know that there are so many other ones that I'm sure I can, give me a couple seconds, I can pull it up, or you can feel free to reach out to me and I can send you our list of camps, and I know they do fill up kind of quickly in terms of they might, and
Can we
Camp
ask you
Erin.
just to attach that list to that email follow-up that I know you're going to send out, and then everyone can access what they think is going to be most helpful to them. And then I heard you say you have a colleague that helps specialize in that. So I'm wondering if at any point in future summers, right? Like you never know when you're going to be impacted by grief or loss. Could someone just call Judi's house and say, hey, can you connect me with whoever could give me information?
Absolutely. And Judi's house is available. I mean, we're not a crisis, but you can call Judi's house and ask to get connected with. We have wonderful grief coordinators, grief care coordinator team of folks who really just are that first point of contact for families, whether it be families who are interested in Judi's house services, are, not sure what they need. Maybe they call because they have another type of grief experience, maybe related to an incarceration. And we have the ability to point them in the direction of the resource that's going to be the right fit. Camp Erin is a really popular one that I know a lot of families reach out to.
So we'll make sure to share some of those resources in that follow-up email. Katie, we've talked a lot about resources for youth, and we've talked about the importance for parents really to connect with their youth in that process. Can you share a little more of your thoughts around how parents who are also grieving can find a balance of being honest with emotions, but not putting that responsibility for managing emotions on kids? We know that that's a tough balance.
It absolutely is. And we know, especially for adults who are grieving themselves, it can be especially tricky to manage, how do I take care of myself and my child at the same time? Because just taking care of myself right now feels next to impossible. And so that's where, at Judi's house, we really focus on that whole family. So our adult groups really wanting to support adults. We provide parenting, caregiving skills in our group. Each group has a coping skill, and each group for the adults, has a parenting or a caregiving skill, because we know being able to figure out how to do this family grief experience is new. And so that importance of our number one most important parenting, caregiving skill is self-care. Because we know we talk about, and I'm sure some folks are familiar with this analogy, but that idea of the airplane analogy. When you go on a plane and the oxygen masks come down and you're traveling with a small child, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first, because if you put it on your child and then you pass out, who's going to take care of that child, right? Because you need to prioritize yourself and your grief as well in order to take care of that child. And so I think it's just as important for adults to reach out for support for their grief as getting their child connected to resources as well, and prioritizing, I'm not okay. I need some extra help. And so in terms of modeling that grief, it can be tricky, and not wanting to put that responsibility on the child to take care of the adult, right? And to let them know it's okay that I'm sad, I miss our person, that this is really hard. And Aunt Susie is the person that takes care of me when I really need to cry really hard, so that when you need to cry really hard, I can be here for you, right? So modeling that, you can handle their grief, right? Because we know a lot of kids will say, I don't want to cry in front of my parent, guardian, adult, because I don't want to make them upset, right? We hear that a lot, and want to let kids know that the adults in their lives can handle it, because they have their resources to support them. I have my therapist that supports me, right? So that I can take care of you. So those sorts of conversations are really important, and letting them know when you're having a hard day, because then they can say, I'm having a hard day too, right? So it opens up those conversations.
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in being honest with kids, and making sure that we create that opportunity where they too can express their emotions, and recognize we all have emotions, right? Sometimes they're big emotions. And I just want to name that, some members in our community have been heavily impacted by multiple losses. And sometimes when you're in that caregiver role, it's hard for you to say, wow, like let me take stock of everything that's kind of landing in my virtual backpack that I carry around, and how heavy it's getting. And I really appreciate you just kind of re-emphasizing that message of you have to do self-care. And if you're in question, or if you don't know how to do that, or if you are kind of wondering, am I doing that? Judi's House is a great place. You just pick up that phone and you just ask those questions, and they will get you connected with it, whether it's a resource, a person, a group, anything that may be helpful to you. You just got to pick up that phone and ask. I have a couple of logistical questions, and I feel like you did share, but I just want to make sure we're clear. Judi's House is free regardless of insurance. Is that correct? Yeah.
That is correct. We don't even ask for insurance information. We really want this, and I didn't even mention this either, but I know we have this same workshop or webinar happening in Spanish, but we also have services in Spanish. And so really wanting this to be available to anyone any family in the community who's grieving a death loss, regardless of, whether you speak English or Spanish or income, insurance, all of those things. We have wonderful, wonderful support in the community from donors and grants that really allow us to do this work for free. So, yep, no cost.
And recognizing that the Denver Metro in general, we have a number of individuals who speak languages other than English. And I know most community agencies have done really good faith effort around English and Spanish services. If there was a family that spoke a different language, does your organization provide access to any type of translation or interpretation services, or are there other referral sources that you may share?
Yep, we would provide a referral to really, because I think when grief is so, connected with culture and, religion and some of these different pieces, that sometimes there's other resources in the community when there's another language spoken that is connected to a community resource that's really going to be able to fully wrap around that family in terms of not just their grief, but what other cultural pieces might be coming up for them, and can do that even better than Judi's House can. And so just wanting to, yes, those referrals we have a great resource referral process and list that can really connect families of, different languages around that process.
Appreciate that. And then recognizing, we all have our different barriers to accessing care. One of the most common barriers that I'm familiar with is transportation. And so if a family or an individual was unable to access services on site due to transportation, is there plans for continuity for virtual services in the coming months or the coming years? Yeah. How's that looking?
Yeah. And so again, really wanting to support families who are grieving. And so, as I mentioned, and I think I saw maybe a question of, yes, so we go out into middle schools specifically and provide our therapeutic grief groups to middle school students. There's a process for that. So if you're interested in that, reach out to me and I can help you become familiar with that process. We do have virtual services available right now for families. We do not have virtual groups, but we do have virtual individual, family, and couples right now, and can utilize that similar curriculum-based model in terms of how we approach that grief support model. And so that is something we have available now. And so that's something that, families, again, can just call and ask. And we know sometimes with transportation, we have other ways of supporting families with some of those transportation barriers. And on a very case-by-case basis, we can support with some of those needs as well. And so just, give us a call and we'll see how we can support.
Really appreciate that, Katie. And again, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your space, for the care and compassion you bring to this work. As we close out today's session on Supporting Grieving Families webinar, we invite your feedback. Katie, I know you had a survey. Do you want to put that over in the chat one more time? I know someone has that link. Just to give you that one more opportunity. I see it's already over there.
Thanks, Leah.
And then just as a reminder to our participants one more time, Katie's going to send you a great summary email. You're going to get a copy of the handouts that were referenced in this session, the video recording of this session if you want to go back. Maybe if you want to watch it with a family member or a friend or a partner or someone else who could benefit from this, we encourage you, as well as a link to home-based grief activities for families, especially with summer that is coming up. Very important resource. I see that there are no additional questions, so I'm also going to thank our participants. At this time, we're going to go ahead and stop that recording. We will remain in the room for a couple